I stopped my family from dropping my sister off a temple roof to test her blessing. When I asked if they'd still love me after, my mother cried and said, "You killed our faith." I just held Kavya tighter. That was nearly a year ago. This morning, she took her first steps while the court ordered the temple's roof dismantled. I refused to drop my baby sister from the temple roof. You see, every first Friday of December, our village gathered at the Baba Umar shrine. The ritual was simple. Babies under 2 years old got tossed from the 30-foot temple roof. Men waited below with a stretched bedsheet to catch them. The baby who cried the least was blessed. The one who cried the most was cursed. My brother didn't cry at all when he was dropped. 20 years later, he became the youngest temple steward in our district. My cousin Arjun screamed for 3 minutes straight. He died in a motorcycle accident at 19. Everyone whispered about the curse. I never believed in the blessing or the curse until my nephew Mihir fell. When Uncle Prasad let go of him from the roof, something went wrong. The men holding the sheet weren't ready. One corner slipped. Mihir hit the edge of the sheet, then bounced onto the stone courtyard. The crack his skull made against the ground still wakes me up at night. He survived, but he never walked properly again. The steward said it was because his mother had impure thoughts during pregnancy. The villagers believed him. They always believed him. December was coming, and my baby sister Kavya had just turned 1. Mom started fasting to purify herself. Dad practiced his dropping technique with sacks of rice off our roof. "The wrist motion has to be perfect," he'd mutter. "Too much spin, and they missed the sheet." I watched him obsess over the angle, the timing, the release, like he was training for the Olympics of baby dropping. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I started having nightmares. Not about Kavya falling, but about her not falling. About me doing something to stop it. The dreams got so vivid I'd wake up with my arms stretched out like I was catching her myself. That's when I met Ravi at the internet cafe. He was researching infant mortality rates in Karnataka for his journalism degree. When I saw the statistics on his screen, something inside me cracked. "Those numbers include the babies who don't get caught," I said before I could stop myself. He turned around. "What do you mean?" So I told him everything. The crying measurements, the blessing charts, the way my aunt still lights candles for her son who flew wrong 30 years ago. Ravi's eyes got wider with each detail. "This is actually happening in 2019? Every year. 200 babies minimum, just in our village." He opened his laptop again and started typing furiously. "We need to document this. Number." I grabbed his hand. "They'll know it was me. My family will be destroyed." But then I thought about Kavya's soft skull, her tiny fingers that grabbed mine when she slept, her laugh that sounded like bells. "Okay," I whispered, "but we do it my way." For the next 2 weeks, I became a spy in my own home. I took photos of Dad's practice sessions, recorded Mom chanting purification prayers, documented every conversation about wind patterns and sheet tension. Ravi connected me with child welfare activists in Bangalore. They were horrified but not surprised. "We've been trying to stop this for years," one said, "but without someone from inside." That was me. The ceremony day arrived at dawn. Hundreds of families gathered at the temple, babies dressed in gold thread and marigolds, mothers with empty arms ready to throw their children to fate, fathers arguing about sheet positioning. I stood with Kavya in my arms. She was wearing the ceremonial outfit Mom had sewn, red silk with silver bells that jingled when she moved. The steward started calling names alphabetically. We were 7th in line. The first baby went up, an 18-month-old boy named Aaron. His father climbed the temple stairs slowly, ceremoniously. At the top, he held Aaron up to the sun, then dropped him. The crowd counted: 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Thud. The sheet caught him. Clean catch, minimum crying. Blessed. The second baby wasn't as lucky. She twisted in the air, clipped the sheet's edge, and rolled onto the ground. Her mother's scream cut through the celebration. "Wind interference," the steward announced. "Not counted. Bring her back next year, if she survived that long." My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Ravi, they're here." I looked toward the temple entrance. 3 police cars, 6 child welfare officers, and behind them, a news van with a satellite dish. Dad saw them at the same time. "Devi, what did you do?" But I was already running, not away from him, toward the temple stairs. With Kavya clutched against my chest, I climbed faster than anyone expected. "This ends today," I shouted. My voice echoed off the ancient stones. No more babies, no more drops, no more curses. The police were pushing through the crowd now. Parents started grabbing their babies, backing away. 3 days later, a constable knocked on the safe house door holding a thick envelope. The legal filing felt heavy in my hands. Pages and pages of accusations typed on official letterhead. The temple committee was suing me for destruction of religious heritage, defamation, inciting public disorder, and something called willful disruption of sacred practices. I scanned the list of plaintiffs, recognizing every signature from our village council, the merchant association, even the school board members. My family's name wasn't there. That silence hurt more than any lawsuit could. The constable waited while I signed the receipt, his eyes avoiding mine like I carried some contagious disease. Inspector came into the room and took the papers, flipping through them with practiced speed. She made notes in the margins, circled key phrases, then set them aside and picked up her phone to call the lawyer they'd assigned to my case. While she talked legal strategy, I watched Kavya playing with wooden blocks on the floor, stacking them high before knocking them down with squeals of delight. She had no idea her big sister had just become the most hated person in 3 districts. The next morning, Ravi texted me to meet him at a tea stall 2 villages over. I told Inspector I needed air, needed to move, needed to feel less trapped. She assigned 2 plainclothes officers to follow at a distance. The tea stall owner pretended not to recognize me, but his hands shook when he poured our cups. Ravi pulled out his phone and showed me photos from his laptop screen. 3 more villages had the same ritual, he explained quickly, keeping his voice low. Parents were starting to refuse after hearing about what happened at our temple. One mother in Hosur had barricaded herself in her house when the elders came for her twin boys. Another family in Mysore had fled in the night rather than participate. The movement was spreading faster than anyone expected. He slid a folder across the table with printouts of parent testimonies, medical reports from other districts, even a petition with 200 signatures demanding government intervention. My story was becoming their story. Back at the safe house 2 days days later, I spent the afternoon teaching Kavya to walk. She gripped my fingers tight, taking tiny, uncertain steps across the worn carpet. Each milestone felt stolen somehow. If I hadn't acted, would she have been blessed or cursed? Would she be walking at all? Or would she be like Mihir with his twisted leg and constant pain? The question haunted me as she stumbled forward, trusting me to catch her if she fell. I always caught her. Dr. Rao arrived that evening with her research team, laptops and boxes of files filling our small living room. They'd spent days at the district hospital going through admission records. 17 babies injured in the ritual over 5 years, she reported, spreading photographs across the coffee table. 3 deaths officially listed as accidents during religious ceremony. The real number was probably higher since many families never brought injured babies to the hospital, preferring traditional healers or accepting injuries as divine will. One photo showed a baby with a fractured skull. Another had a dislocated shoulder. The youngest victim was 11 months old. Dr. Rao's assistant, a young woman with tired eyes, compiled everything into a digital database while the doctor explained how they'd present this evidence in court. Medical records didn't lie, even if people did. That night, my phone rang with my brother's number. I almost didn't answer, but Inspector nodded that it was safe. His voice sounded strained, formal, like someone might be listening. They were threatening to expose father's land records, he said. Some irregularity with property taxes from 20 years ago that could ruin him. Think of the family, he kept saying. His blessed status from being the baby who didn't cry meant nothing now that I'd destroyed everything. The call lasted 3 minutes before he hung up. I sat there holding the dead phone, remembering how proud our parents were when he didn't make a sound during his drop. The golden child who proved our family's faith. A week passed in a blur of legal preparations. The first hearing approached fast. Inspector brought me to the courthouse preparation room where my lawyer waited with stacks of documents. She'd already warned me what to expect. The steward's lawyer would claim religious freedom, paint me as a westernized girl trying to destroy tradition. They'd make me the villain who attacked thousands of years of sacred practice. The judge would be sympathetic to their arguments since he probably participated in the ritual with his own children. We had medical evidence and child welfare laws on our side, but tradition ran deeper than law in our district. That night, unable to sleep, I found a notebook and started writing down every baby I remembered from past ceremonies. 37 names filled the pages. How many were limping like Mihir? How many didn't survive their blessing? Each name was a story nobody wanted to tell. The next morning, the steward appeared on regional television. How does Devi remember the exact sound of Mihir's skull hitting stone after all this time? The way she counts 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, while babies fall shows such a strange mix of ritual and danger. I watched from the safe house as tears streamed down his face. One misguided girl wants to destroy thousands of years of tradition, he said to the sympathetic interviewer. The babies who don't cry become leaders, doctors, engineers. It was proven by generations of success. The interviewer nodded along, never challenging his claims, never asking about the babies who fell wrong. The segment ended with photos of successful blessed babies, including my brother in his government uniform. 2 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the lawyer's office where Dr. Rao was preparing testimony. The doctor who treated me here after his fall walked in carrying a small flash drive. He looked around nervously before approaching our table. He'd been documenting injuries for years, he whispered, sliding the drive to Dr. Rao too scared to speak up before. But seeing one girl stand against the entire village gave him courage. The drive contained photos, medical reports, even video testimonies from parents whose children were permanently injured. Evidence they thought would stay buried in hospital basement files. That night, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. A brick crashed through the safe house window, landing on Kavya's empty crib. The note tied around it with temple thread said, "Return the baby to her destiny." Inspector arrived within minutes, increasing security, posting more constables outside. But I saw the doubt in their eyes when they looked at me. Some probably had babies who went through the ritual. Some probably believed I was cursed for interfering with divine will. The investigation continued, but everyone knew who threw that brick. Everyone always knew everything in our village. They just chose when to see and when to stay blind. Days blurred together in that safe house, each one bringing new threats and revelations that made my stomach twist tighter. On the 12th day, I was sitting on the floor feeding Kavya mashed bananas when she grabbed my finger and looked straight at me. "Didi," she said, clear as a bell, her first word meaning big sister, and I had to turn away so the guard wouldn't see me crying because in that moment I knew I'd done the right thing even if it meant losing everything else. The spoon shook in my hand as I gave her another bite, pretending our world hadn't exploded around us, pretending armed guards at every door was normal, pretending the death threats slipped under the door each night were just bad dreams. Inspector came by that afternoon with a thick folder and a grim expression, spreading papers across the coffee table that made my blood run cold. The temple committee had been collecting blessing fees, 5,000 rupees for every baby dropped, and the receipts went back decades with careful notations about which families paid extra for better positioning under the sheet. The steward owned 3 properties in Bangalore, 2 apartment buildings, and a shopping complex, all purchased with cash in the years after he took over the temple. Bank statements showed regular deposits every December, always in cash, always just after the ceremony. Photos of his son's wedding showed gold jewelry that would cost more than our village earned in 10 years. The blessing charts we'd all believed in, the careful records of which babies succeeded and which ones failed. They'd been tracking something else entirely, which families had money and influence, which ones could be squeezed for more donations. My hands trembled as I looked through page after page of evidence. Each receipt, another baby risked for profit. Each bank statement, another family's desperation monetized. The next morning, my father showed up at the safe house, and the guards almost didn't let him in because he looked like a stranger, his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loose like he'd aged 20 years in 2 weeks. He sat across from me but wouldn't meet my eyes, his hands twisting in his lap as he spoke in a voice I barely recognized. "Your mother won't eat," he said. "She sits in the prayer room all day saying saying Kavya is cursed now, that she'll never have a normal life, that the gods have turned their backs on us. The neighbors throw garbage in our yard, he continued. They painted curse words on our walls. Your brother's engagement was called off because no one wants to marry into a family of blasphemers. He stood to leave without touching the tea I'd made him, without asking about Kavya, who was napping in the next room, without saying goodbye or looking back. 3 days later, we drove to the courthouse in an armored vehicle. Kavya clutched against my chest as we pushed through crowds that made my heart race. The steps swarmed with protesters, some holding signs reading, "Babies are not projectiles," and others waving banners about protecting tradition, attacking Western influence, defending Hindu culture. Someone threw an egg that splattered against the car window, making Kavya cry, and I held her tighter as guards formed a circle around us. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning couldn't mask the smell of too many bodies pressed together, too much anger concentrated in one space. The steward's lawyer stood before the judge arguing that this was an attack on Hindu culture by Western-influenced activists trying to destroy our traditions, and the judge, an elderly man with prayer beads visible under his robe, nodded thoughtfully like he was actually considering this argument. Our lawyer jumped up to present the medical evidence, and suddenly Mihir's face filled the screen. Before and after photos that showed his cracked skull, the surgical scars, the way his eyes didn't quite focus anymore. The steward's lawyer objected immediately, saying one unfortunate accident doesn't negate centuries of blessings, that we can't destroy tradition because of human error, that the men holding the sheet were to blame, not the ritual itself. The judge allowed the evidence, but I could see doubt in his eyes, the same doubt I'd seen in the village, the fear that changing anything meant abandoning everything. That night back at the safe house, Dr. Rao called me into the kitchen where 3 young mothers sat hunched over cups of tea, their faces drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from keeping terrible secrets. They'd come secretly, terrified their husbands would find out, each one clutching medical files they'd hidden for years. "My baby has seizures from the fall," one whispered, showing me videos on her phone of a toddler convulsing on the floor, "but my husband says it's because I didn't fast properly during pregnancy." Another showed me her son's hearing aid, explained how he'd landed wrong and damaged his inner ear, how they'd spent their life savings on treatments while still donating to the temple, because her mother-in-law insisted the curse would get worse if they stopped. The third woman just cried, unable to speak about her daughter who died 6 months after the ceremony, from complications no one wanted to link to a traumatic brain injury. They wanted to testify but feared retribution, knew their families would disown them, their children would suffer more, their lives would become unbearable. I held their hands and promised protection I wasn't sure we could provide, watched them leave one by one through the back door, melting back into the night like ghosts. Sleep became impossible after that, my dreams filled with babies falling like rain, their cries mixing with the sound of sheets tearing, skulls cracking, mothers screaming. I woke one night to find Kavya's crib empty, and panic flooded through me so fast I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only run barefoot through the safe house until I found her in the bathroom with a guard who was warming her milk because she'd been fussy and he didn't want to wake me. Trust had become a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Every shadow could be a threat, every sound could be danger approaching. Ravi published his first article the next day, and within hours the internet exploded with reactions that made my phone buzz constantly with notifications. The hashtag number BABIESARENTPROJECTILES started trending nationally, shared by celebrities and activists, doctors and parents who'd never heard of our village but were horrified by what they learned. The Steward supporters fought back with hashtag preserve our traditions, posting photos of healthy adults who'd been dropped as babies, testimonials about blessings received, warnings about abandoning customs that had protected communities for generations. The battle went digital with both sides recruiting warriors, sharing selective evidence, twisting facts to support their positions. News channels picked up the story, sending reporters to interview villagers who either slammed doors or spoke passionately about tradition depending on their stance. My photo started circulating, some calling me a hero and others calling me a destroyer of culture, and I had to delete my social media accounts when the messages became too vicious to read. 2 days later, Inspector arrived with more evidence that made everything else pale in comparison. Bankers' boxes full of documents that exposed decades of deception. The blessing charts we'd all believed in, the careful tracking of which babies succeeded after being dropped, it was all fabricated. Every entry crafted to support the narrative they wanted to tell. Babies marked as blessed simply had influential families who could afford to donate more, their success in life guaranteed by money and connections, not divine intervention. The correlation between crying and future fortune was manufactured, statistical manipulation designed to keep families believing, keep them paying, keep them risking their children for a lie. Pages and pages of evidence showed how they'd hidden the failures, the babies who died or were disabled, marking them as cursed due to parental sins rather than traumatic injury from a 30-foot fall. The steward had kept 2 sets of books, one for the public showing divine patterns, and one for himself tracking payment schedules and family wealth. I'm really curious about those 2 different books the steward kept, one fake for the public and one real for tracking money. Did he write them by hand or use a computer? My hands shook as I read through entry after entry, each one representing a child thrown from a roof for profit. Each notation, another family deceived into risking everything for a blessing that was nothing more than an accounting trick. The security guard burst through the door just as I was taking photos of the pages with my phone, his hand reaching for his radio, but Ravi grabbed his wrist and they struggled while I shoved the books into my bag and we ran down the back stairs 3 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. We made it to the safe house just as my uncle's car screeched into the driveway, and I could smell the alcohol on him from 20 feet away as he stumbled out yelling about how his daughter's wedding was canceled because of me. The security team Dr. Rao had arranged jumped up from their card game and blocked him at the door while he screamed that no one would marry into our cursed family now, his face red and spit flying crying as he lunged at me, but they held him back. The next morning, our lawyer called to say the judge had ordered medical exams for every child dropped in the past 5 years, which meant hundreds of kids would need x-rays and neurological tests to check for hidden injuries. The Steward's legal team filed an appeal within hours, claiming this violated religious privacy and that the government had no right to examine children who participated in sacred rituals. Day after day passed in that safe house, Kavya crawling around the unfamiliar rooms while I jumped at every car door slam, until finally on day 20 I couldn't take it anymore and video called my mother. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks, sitting surrounded by empty ritual plates she'd been using for prayers, and when she saw my face, she said, "I should have been dropped properly as a baby. Maybe then I wouldn't have grown up to destroy them." I hung up and ran to Kavya's room, where I sat on the floor crying until Dr. Rao found me and sat down beside me, putting her hand on my shoulder and saying that saving one child often means losing everything else, but that child gets to live, and I needed to remember that. 2 days later, our lawyer called with news that made my hands shake. 3 former temple committee members had agreed to testify about how the steward changed the ritual 20 years ago, making the drops higher and more dangerous because it brought bigger crowds and more donations. They had documents showing he'd studied which heights created the most drama without quite killing the babies, calculating the perfect balance of risk and spectacle to maximize profit. The national media descended on our village like locusts, camera crews on every corner interviewing families, and cracks started appearing in the unified front, as some young parents admitted on camera they only participated because they were scared of being shunned. I watched the footage on my laptop, seeing my own house in the background of one shot where my mother had hung white funeral cloths in all the windows, the traditional sign that a family member had died, and I realized she was mourning me while I was still alive. The steward fought back by organizing a massive rally on day 25, standing on a makeshift stage shouting into a microphone about how outsiders wanted to take their children and raise them without values. The crowd roaring approval, though I noticed in the footage that many young parents were notably absent. Our legal team responded by filing formal charges of child endangerment, fraud, and criminal conspiracy, presenting the financial records I'd photographed as evidence, and within hours, a judge ordered the steward's assets frozen pending investigation, while his lawyer went on every news channel calling it judicial persecution of Hindu faith. That night, Kavya developed a fever, and even though the doctor said it was just a cold, I couldn't stop checking on her every 10 minutes, convinced this was cosmic punishment for destroying our family, sitting beside her crib all night watching her tiny chest rise and fall and jumping every time she coughed or stirred. The morning sun came through the window, and I realized I'd fallen asleep on the floor next to her crib, with my hand still on her back feeling each breath, and when my phone buzzed with a WhatsApp notification, I almost ignored it, but Dr. Rao's name made me look, and what I saw made my whole body go cold, because someone had sent her a video from 1995 showing the steward himself holding a baby at the temple roof, and as he dropped the child, you could see something the crowd below couldn't see, which was a second net stretched underneath the ceremonial sheet, and the baby who fell was his own grandson, who everyone said had been blessed because he didn't cry. But now I understood he didn't cry because he knew he was safe the whole time, while every other baby in our village risked their actual lives, and I forwarded it to Ravi immediately, who called me within seconds saying, "Holy shit, this changes everything," and within an hour the video was everywhere on every WhatsApp group and Facebook page and Twitter thread, with people sharing it faster than anyone could delete it, and the protests outside the courthouse that had been split between supporting us and opposing us suddenly shifted because even the traditionalists couldn't defend this, and mothers who'd dropped their own babies were screaming about how the steward had protected his family while theirs suffered. And by noon, Inspector Desai called to say she was arresting 2 temple committee members for financial fraud because they'd been skimming money from the blessing donations, and under questioning they revealed something that made my stomach turn, which was that the whole blessing system only started in 1998 when the current steward took over, and before that babies were just held up to the sun for prayers, but he'd invented the dropping ceremony to bring in more donations from desperate parents, and I was still processing this when, 2 days later, my brother showed up at the safe house, which scared me because no one was supposed to know where we were, but he looked broken and thin, and when the guards let him in after checking him for weapons, he sat across from me and said, "I need to tell you something about my drop," and I knew whatever came next would hurt, but I wasn't prepared for him saying they drugged me, so I wouldn't cry, because father paid extra for the blessing dose and he remembered being dizzy and his limbs feeling heavy and the men below looking blurry, and that's why he'd been blessed all these years, not because of divine favor, but because of drugs given to a baby, and my whole understanding of our family shattered because if dad knew about the drugs, then what else did he know? And my brother cried, which I'd never seen him do, and said, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you and Kavya from this," and we held each other while Kavya played with her toys, unaware that her perfect blessed brother was just another victim. And the next morning, the steward himself appeared at our safe house gate with 5 village elders, and through the fence he made his offer, which was 1 million rupees to withdraw all charges and testimony, plus our family would be welcomed back, and Kavya would receive guaranteed blessed status without even doing the ceremony, and I looked at his face, which had terrorized our village for 20 years and felt nothing but disgust, so I gathered all the spit in my mouth and launched it through the fence onto his shoes and told him Kavya doesn't need your fake blessings, and he left, but not before saying, "You'll regret this when your family suffers." And that night, as I brushed my hair, clumps came out in the brush, and more fell when I ran my fingers through it, and I knew it was stress, but seeing the physical proof of what this was doing to me made it real, and Kavya crawled over and played with the fallen strands, making little piles and giggling like it was a game, not knowing her sister was literally falling apart, to keep her safe. And 3 days later, the medical examination results arrived at the courthouse, and Inspector Desai let me read them, and the numbers made me sick because of 47 children examined, 31 showed signs of head trauma, and 12 had developmental delays, and 4 had permanent disabilities that would affect them forever, and the judge reading the report went pale pale and kept shaking his head and muttering, "This can't be right." But it was right, and every number represented a baby whose life had been damaged for a lie. And that evening, my father appeared on the regional news channel standing outside our family home with reporters shoving microphones at him, and he looked directly at the camera and said, "We have no daughter named Devi, and our family has disowned her for bringing shame to our traditions." But even as he said it, I could see his hands shaking, and when he turned to go inside, I noticed he was still wearing the watch I'd given him for his birthday last year, which made the rejection hurt even more because some part of him still cared, but not enough to choose his daughters over the village. And Dr. Rao saw me crying and took me to meet 3 other women who'd exposed dangerous traditions in their communities, and one woman who'd fought against child marriage in Rajasthan said, "You lose your old life, but you save countless future lives, and it's a trade worth making." And another who'd exposed female infanticide in Haryana said the hardest part isn't the threats, it's knowing you can never go back to being the person you were before. And they all had the same tired eyes and premature gray hair and hands that shook when they drank tea, but they also had photos of children they'd saved and letters from families they'd protected. And one said, "We're not heroes, we're just people who couldn't look away anymore." And 2 days later, I sat with Kavya on the safe house floor, teaching her new words and pointing at pictures in a board book saying bird, and she repeated bud, and I said flower, and she said fower, and then I said safe, and she looked at me with those huge brown eyes and said safe, and each word felt like defiance against everyone who'd wanted to throw her from heights before she could speak them. And she crawled into my lap and patted my face with her tiny hands, like she was comforting me, and I held her close, breathing in her baby smell of powder and milk, knowing that every strand of hair I lost, and every night of sleep I missed, and every family member who disowned me was worth it for this moment of her being safe and whole and able to learn words in peace. The patterns in those medical exam results make me wonder how many families suspected something was wrong but stayed quiet. 31 out of 47 kids with head trauma isn't random chance. That's a clear pattern that someone must have noticed before now. The next morning, a young man showed up at the courthouse looking for me, and when security brought him over, I saw something familiar in his eyes, and he said his name was Arjun, and he was the steward's grandson, and I tensed up ready for an attack, but instead he sat down heavily and told me he was 24 now and had been dropped as a baby, and everyone said he was blessed, but he'd had vertigo his whole life and couldn't climb stairs without gripping the rail, and even with the hidden net they used for important families, he was traumatized and had nightmares about falling, and his grandfather made him lie about feeling blessed at every ceremony. 3 days later, on day 38, Dr. Rao burst into our safe house waving papers and said international child rights organizations were joining our case, and UNICEF was sending observers and Human Rights Watch was documenting everything, and the pressure was building so fast that the state government announced they were launching an inquiry into all blessing rituals involving physical risk to children across Karnataka and similar practices in neighboring states. That night, I woke up to the guard dog whimpering and found him collapsed by his water bowl, and when I screamed for the inspector, she took one look and called for backup, and within minutes they were testing everything and found poison in the water tank on the roof, and she grabbed Kavya while officers packed our things, and we moved to a new location in unmarked cars with Kavya crying from being woken up and bounced around in the middle of the night. The next day, the court ordered the temple sealed pending investigation, and we watched on the news as the Steward supporters formed a human chain around the building, but police in riot gear broke through, and when they got inside, they found filing cabinets full of records hidden in a secret room behind the altar with detailed notes about injuries and deaths going back decades, all marked with codes about which families paid extra for the hidden nets and which babies were allowed to fall onto stone. 2 days later, on day 40, my brother showed up at the courthouse and handed me an envelope without meeting my eyes, and inside was a letter from my mother with no words, just a photo of my naming ceremony where she's holding baby me and smiling, and next to it Kavya's hospital bracelet from when she was born, and I stared at those 2 items trying to figure out if she was condemning me for destroying tradition or telling me she understood why I saved Kavya. The steward's lawyer played his final card the next morning, showing the judge edited videos of me at the temple, claiming I was mentally unstable, and pointing out how I'd climbed the stairs with a baby and threatened people. But Dr. Rao stood up with a folder full of psychological evaluation results, showing I was completely sane and had acted to prevent imminent harm to a child, and she had 3 psychiatrists who'd reviewed the case and agreed. News started coming in from other villages where similar rituals were happening, and young parents were speaking out, and number Save the Babies was trending higher than Nabrar Preserve Our Traditions, and reporters were finding more locations where babies were thrown from heights or passed through fire or buried briefly in sand for blessings. On day 43, during court proceedings, a woman in a blue sari stood up in the gallery and said her baby died from the fall 10 years ago, and they told her it was because she ate meat during pregnancy, and she believed them and blamed herself and tried to purify herself for years, and the courtroom went completely silent as she sobbed. The next morning, while we waited in the courthouse hallway, Kavya pulled herself up using a bench and took one step and another all on her own, with each step steady and sure, and I started crying openly, thinking about how she might never have reached this milestone if I hadn't grabbed her that day. Finally, the judge came back with his preliminary ruling and banged his gavel and said the ritual was banned pending full trial, and the Steward supporters erupted shouting about tradition and culture, while police formed protective barriers around us and rushed us toward a safe vehicle as people threw flowers at the Steward and shoes at me. That night at the safe house, I woke to breaking glass and angry voices outside and grabbed Kavya from her crib as rocks crashed through the window and someone pounded on the door screaming about tradition and honor, while the inspector rushed us toward the back exit with glass crunching under our feet and Kavya screaming louder than I'd ever heard her scream before, her tiny body shaking as we ran through dark alleys with the mob's footsteps getting closer until we finally lost them and collapsed in another safe house where I held my sister and felt her heart heart racing against mine. Days blurred together in our third hiding place where the windows had bars and the walls felt like they were closing in, and I watched Kavya reach toward the barred window saying out over and over while I couldn't even give her fresh air because showing our faces meant danger, and I started counting the days since I'd felt real sunlight on my skin. Then news came that the steward had collapsed during police questioning, and his chest pains turned into a full heart attack that landed him in the hospital where his supporters gathered claiming God was punishing us for persecuting a holy man, but his grandson pulled the inspector aside and admitted this was his third heart attack in 5 years from the stress of keeping secrets about failed ceremonies and dead babies. The inspector sat with me one evening and told me about her own village where pregnant women had to walk across burning coals to prove their purity, and how her mother lost 3 babies before someone finally stopped it, and she squeezed my hand saying I was saving lives even if it didn't feel like it right now. Meanwhile, the financial investigators dug through temple records and found millions of rupees meant for schools, and wells had gone into private accounts and luxury cars for the steward's family, which brought the Economic Crimes Division into our case with their own charges and evidence. Back home, my father lost his job at the textile factory when the owner got pressure from temple supporters, and someone destroyed my mother's vegetable garden she'd grown for 20 years, and my brother's promotion at the bank got mysteriously canceled with no explanation, while our family paid the price for my choice every single day. The prosecutor called to say the full trial was set for 3 months away, which felt like forever, and the steward was already requesting bail from his hospital bed, where reporters photographed him looking frail in a wheelchair, which somehow made him more dangerous, because now he looked like a victim, instead of someone who'd thrown babies off roofs for decades. I spent hours teaching Kavya the songs our mother taught me when I was little, and my voice cracked on the lullabies about peacocks and monsoons, because she might never see our village celebrations or dance at harvest festivals if we couldn't go home, and all I could give her were these fragments of the culture I'd torn her away from. Then Ravi called with something that made my hands shake as he explained what he'd found in old temple records from 1975, showing the steward's own infant son had died during a drop ceremony when the wind caught him wrong, and the men missed the catch, and the steward had spent 44 years making other parents risk what killed his own child, which explained everything and nothing at the same time. The next morning, newspapers reported the state child welfare department would require safety inspections for all religious ceremonies involving minors, and our case was setting precedent across Karnataka as more villages questioned their own dangerous traditions. My phone rang at 3 a.m., and when I saw it was Arjun's mother calling from our village, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and her voice came through shaky and raw. She said she'd kept quiet for 20 years about what really happened to Arjun after his drop ceremony, and now with everything in the news, she couldn't stay silent anymore because Arjun had been terrified of heights ever since that day when he screamed for 3 minutes straight. She said he was speeding that night trying to avoid the new bridge construction on the highway, and that's when he lost control of his motorcycle trying to take the longer route through the valley, and I sat there in the dark safe house listening to her sob about how the curse wasn't supernatural, it was psychological trauma that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The next morning, Dr. Rao from the child welfare team set up her laptop in our temporary living room and connected us to a video call with 3 young women from Rajasthan who had fought against child marriage in their villages, and I could see the scars on their arms where their families had tried to force them into submission. But they were smiling as they told us we would rebuild our lives different and harder than before, but it would be ours, and one of them showed us the small business she'd started making handicrafts, and another was studying law, and the third one held up her baby daughter born free from the traditions that had trapped generations before her. Day 56 arrived with the first monsoon rains hammering against the safe house windows, and I sat with Kavya on the floor teaching her the word for rain, while my mind kept going back to how we used to put out metal buckets and clay pots to collect water at home, and how mom would make us stand under the first rain of the season for good luck, and every memory now felt split between before and after, like someone had drawn a line through my life with permanent marker. News came through our lawyer that the temple committee was fracturing from within as younger members started distancing themselves from the steward, and 3 of them sent sworn statements saying they'd wanted reforms for years, but the old guard had threatened their families and businesses if they spoke up, and now with the steward in the hospital and media attention focused on our village, the power structure that had held for generations was crumbling like wet clay. What's making me wonder is why the steward kept doing this ritual after his own baby died from it. Did grief turn into something else over those 44 years? Our lawyer filed additional charges the next week requesting the classification be changed from religious practice to systematic child abuse and attempted murder for every baby dropped in the past 10 years based on hospital records we'd obtained showing the real injury rates, and the prosecutor said this could set precedent for the entire state, and suddenly what started as me refusing to drop my sister had become a legal battle that could protect thousands of children. Day 60 brought my brother back to the safe house, and he stood at the door looking older than his years, saying our mother wanted to see Kavya just once, and she promised not to try anything, but I looked at him and remembered how he'd grabbed my arm trying to take Kavya from me that day at the temple, and I told him trust once shattered couldn't be rebuilt on wants alone, and he nodded like he understood, but I saw his shoulders shake as he walked back to his car. The following week, a group of 15 mothers whose babies had died or been permanently injured in the ritual formed a support group, and they marched to the temple carrying empty cradles, and the image spread across social media faster than wildfire, showing these women with their empty arms raised toward the temple roof where their children had been dropped, and even the most devoted supporters couldn't ignore the visual of all those empty cradles lined up on the temple steps. International pressure started mounting when UNESCO caught wind of the story and sent a formal notice threatening to revoke the temple's World Heritage status, which would cost the district millions in tourism revenue, and suddenly politicians who had ignored the issue for decades were calling emergency meetings and issuing statements about protecting children and preserving culture responsibly. Day 65 arrived with news that the steward had checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice to hold a press conference from his wheelchair, and we watched on the news as he tried to defend the tradition. But halfway through his speech, his face went gray, and he clutched his chest and collapsed right there in front of the cameras. And this time, even his most loyal supporters saw not a blessed leader, but a broken old man clinging to power that had already slipped through his fingers. That evening, as I was heating milk for dinner, Kavya looked up at me from where she was playing with wooden blocks the child welfare team had brought and said her first full sentence clear as day, asking me if we could go home, and I stood there with the pot in my hand, having no answer because home wasn't a place anymore. It was a concept we'd left behind the day I climbed those temple stairs, and we were refugees from our own blood living in a borrowed house with borrowed toys, while our real life continued without us just 20 kilometers away in a village that would never forgive what I'd done. The lawyer called 2 days later with news that made me drop my phone. The government was setting up a special fast-track court just for our case with 3 judges instead of 1, and the whole thing would be done in months, not years, which meant maybe Kavya would never have to understand what we gave up for this. I picked up my phone from the floor and heard him still talking about precedent and public interest, but all I could think about was how fast everything was moving now, like a train that couldn't stop. The days blurred together with meetings and documents and witness statements until day 70, when my brother called at 3 in the morning, and his voice broke when he said Mom had taken pills, too many pills, and they found her on the bathroom floor, but she was alive, barely alive, in the ICU now. I drove through empty streets with Kavya sleeping in her car seat, and when we got to the hospital, they wouldn't let me see her because her family didn't want me there, the nurses said, looking at me like I was poison. I sat in the waiting room holding Kavya while she played with my hair, not understanding why I was crying so hard my whole body shook. The news spread through the village by sunrise, and something shifted because if keeping tradition meant mothers would rather die than live without it, then maybe the tradition wasn't worth keeping, and the first temple elder said so publicly, which nobody expected. I went back to the hospital every day and sat in the parking lot watching from my car as Dad helped Mom into a wheelchair for her therapy sessions, and they looked so small and broken and old, like the life had been sucked out of them, and I did this. I broke them to save babies who would never know their names. The math of love versus justice never adds up right when you're the one doing the subtraction. 5 days later, the prosecutor called with his voice shaking because they'd found something huge. Insurance policies the steward's family had been taking out on babies before ceremonies, collecting money when things went wrong, turning our sacred ritual into a profit scheme. The criminal charges multiplied overnight, and suddenly this wasn't just about tradition anymore, but about fraud and conspiracy and murder for profit. The final hearing date got set, and the steward's supporters tried one last show of force surrounding the courthouse with signs and chants. But I saw familiar faces in the crowd now holding different signs, supporting the ban, because the tide had turned and even the most devout were questioning what they'd believed. Inside the courtroom, the testimony hit like hammer blows, as parent after parent described babies who never walked right, children with permanent brain damage, families destroyed by grief they weren't allowed to express because it would mean questioning the blessing. The doctors showed x-rays and medical reports and statistics that made the judges lean forward in their seats, asking sharper questions with each witness, while their patience for tradition wore thinner by the minute. Then the steward took a stand against his lawyer's advice and started rambling about divine visions and cosmic balance, and how the blessed children were chosen by the gods, and his own words dug his grave deeper than any prosecutor could because he sounded exactly like what he was, a man who threw babies off roofs and called it holy. During recess, an elderly woman touched my shoulder, and when I turned, she pressed a small temple bell into my hand and whispered that I saved her great-granddaughter, that some of them had been praying for someone like me to finally speak up. The verdict came down like thunder, with all 3 judges unanimous that the steward was guilty on all counts, and the ritual was permanently banned across the state effective immediately, and 7 years in prison for the man who made a business of blessing and cursing babies. The courthouse exploded with noise as celebration and fury crashed together, and I held Kavya tighter while people screamed and cried and hugged and cursed, because this was the end of something that had defined our village for generations, and the beginning of something none of us could imagine yet. Inspector pushed through the chaos and formed a protective circle around us with 5 other officers, while we made our way to the exit doors, and the crowd split like water, with some people spitting at my feet and others bowing their heads and most just staring at me like I was some kind of monster or hero or both. The spit hit my shoes and ran down onto the courthouse steps while we pushed forward, and Kavya buried her face in my neck, and I could feel her heart beating fast against my chest. 3 days later, the news came through official channels that the temple committee had been dissolved by government order, and I watched on Dr. Rao's laptop as workers in hard hats tore down the blessing charts from the temple walls and threw them into a bonfire while villagers watched in silence. The new committee members had to complete 40 hours of child welfare training before they could take their positions, and the dropping platform on the temple roof was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but old nail holes in the stone. Dr. Rao sat across from me in her office with papers spread across her desk and explained that we needed new identities for our safety because the death threats were getting more specific, and someone had posted our photos on social media with a bounty. Devi and Kavya Sharma need to disappear, she said while sliding the documents toward me. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth as I signed papers that killed the person I'd been for 23 years. My phone buzzed with a message from my brother, and my hands shook as I read it, because he wrote that Mom was getting better, and she'd started dreaming about Kavya walking instead of falling, and she wanted me to know that, even though I couldn't see it. I stared at his words for 5 minutes before deleting his number, because that life was dead now, and keeping connections would only put everyone in danger. 2 weeks later, we arrived in our new city 12 hours away by train, and I carried Kavya into a small apartment where nobody knew our faces pictures, or our story, or what we'd done. The play school down the street had bright yellow walls and a playground with swings and slides, and when I enrolled her under her new name, the teacher smiled and said she looked like a happy child. Kavya ran straight to the swings without looking back and pumped her legs in the air while other kids played around her, and none of them knew she was supposed to fly and fall from a temple roof. The counselor's office smelled like vanilla candles, and she asked me what I regretted about everything that happened. Nothing and everything, I told her, and she nodded like this made perfect sense while writing notes on her yellow pad. The sessions helped me process the nightmares where I was back on the temple roof, but this time nobody caught Kavya and I woke up screaming her name. News trickled in through Dr. Rao's encrypted messages that 3 more villages had ended their dropping ceremonies after young parents cited our case in village meetings and demanded change. The insurance policy's discovery changes everything. How long had the steward been making money from babies getting hurt? My mind keeps circling back to those empty cradles on the temple steps and wondering if each mother knew deep down something was wrong but couldn't speak up until now. The ripples spread wider than we'd imagined possible, and each message felt like a tiny victory, even though we'd lost everything to make it happen. Kavya's second birthday came on a humid Thursday, and I bought a small chocolate cake from the bakery near our apartment and stuck 2 pink candles in the frosting. No family gathered around our table, and no aunts sang traditional songs, and no uncles gave blessing money, but Kavya blew out her candles with pure joy on her face because she didn't know this life existed, only because she never flew. That night, after she fell asleep, I finally opened the photo album I'd grabbed during our escape and stared at pictures from last year's ceremony where everyone smiled in their best clothes while babies waited to be thrown. My parents stood proud in their silk saris, and my brother held his blessing certificate, and everyone looked so happy and so complicit in something they never questioned. I closed the album gently and put it on the top shelf of my closet, where it would wait for the day Kavya asked about her roots, and I'd have to explain why we had no family. The next morning, sunlight streamed through our window, and Kavya woke up laughing and reaching for me with total trust in her eyes. I lifted her high above my head, and she squealed with delight while I spun her around our tiny living room, and her giggles filled the space like music. This was how babies should fly, safe in loving hands that would never let go, always caught, always protected, always certain of a gentle landing. This was such an incredible journey to explore together. Thanks for letting me wonder about all these mysteries with you.